Hey guys, it's Chelsea from The Financial Diet, and this week's video is brought to you by the Free Exchange of Ideas. And to exchange those ideas, I am here with David Pakman, who is a fellow YouTuber, a political talk show host, and someone I am personally a huge fan of. So to give you guys a little bit of background, he is the host of The David Pakman Show, which is a show that, how would you describe it?
Left-wing political show. And a bunch of other
Left-wing.
stuff. But that's like the primary.
So you don't portray yourself as just like neutral, unbiased, etc. You come right out and you're like left wing.
I would have no audience if I played to the middle.
That's very interesting. I feel like it's fairly common for people who even have a very strong ideological bent, who clearly have it, to portray themselves as just sort of a neutral arbiter, just observing things.
That can be. I mean, the truth is everybody has bias, everybody has a perspective. It's a question of what do you choose to hide it with, and sometimes people replace political bias with corporate bias or bias to sensationalism or bias towards your advertisers' views. So I just do a left-wing show. I'm upfront about it. People often disagree with me about my conclusions, and that's okay, as long as it's a good faith disagreement based on what I've actually said, not deliberate misstatements about what I've said and straw men and all of that type of thing.
Very cool. And so you also, as it happens, and I didn't know this, I initially reached out to him not knowing this, but you apparently also have a bit of a background in personal finance.
That's right. I have an MBA, and I had two concentrations, financial planning and entrepreneurship, and I'm sort of using both of them, and I'm glad I'm not directly working in those, at least in financial planning, because it's not a field that I would like to be working in. But the knowledge has been super useful for understanding politics and just like household economic circumstances that relate to the decisions that our elected officials make. And in that sense, it was a great area of focus in my grad school studies.
Here on this channel, as you guys will know, we do talk about the macro view of how the people in power or the systems in place impact our individual financial circumstances and decisions. But this is a space, personal finance is a space that is often framed as being apolitical. Or let's be honest, a lot of people in this space are explicitly right-wing. But I would say more often than not, people try to sort of ride the middle and take politics out of the conversation, which I feel that it can't be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's so many ways in which it is political inherently. When you talk about education and how should college be paid for, when you talk about interest rates, predatory credit card and payday lending practices, well, we should be talking about why so many people are even in a situation where that's a product that might appeal to them, or they might think or actually need a product like that, and that has to do with politics. It has to do with our elected officials. When we talk about the bail bonds industrial complex and why that prevents many people who are already economically disadvantaged from even mounting the defense that supposedly everyone is entitled to in our justice system. I mean, all of these are personal finance issues that also cannot be divorced from the politics. So my approach is usually, when I talk about the politics, I talk about what are our elected officials doing, what do Democrats and Republicans want to do. On some of these issues, they actually want very similar things. On others, they want different things. But then also, like, what can you do? You know, if you don't have $1,000 in an emergency fund, that's an emergency. And whatever the politics are that are going on, whether your tax rate is going up or down based on who's in power, not having that emergency fund is an emergency. And there's a lot of different ways that you could immediately focus on sort of building that up.
Are there ways in which the average person can use their own financial growth and their own financial education to in some way affect change or to become more empowered, more lucid, more political, you know?
Absolutely. I mean, if you have a retirement account, the decisions you make about what company do you put your money into, whatever it might be with, mutual funds or whatever the case may be, that has big political impact. The decisions you make about the specific funds and the sorts of companies that you are saying, I am sort of putting my retirement in the same space as companies that are doing one set of business activities or a very different set of business activities, and thinking about how those businesses relate to the climate, for example. I mean, with the idea of voting with your dollars goes very far. I mean, we know because of campaign finance that people who have many dollars are able to vote in a very special and influential
and
way.
Very literal way.
Very literal way, sure. The individual consumer can also do that in the aggregate, and that comes to the products you buy, the companies you support, how you're saving money for retirement or for kids' college or whatever the case may be. All of those decisions, and even including, I mean, when you talk about programs that exist on YouTube, deciding whether you're going to put $100 a month into a cable subscription, supporting probably mostly channels you don't watch and certainly don't want to be supporting in many cases, versus channels like ours or independent media or whatever the case may be. All of those decisions are political, personal finance decisions.
So I, as I've mentioned, watch quite a lot of political YouTube, and I do try to be diverse in my diet, if only to kind of stay abreast of what's happening, although sometimes it becomes overwhelming. But one thing that I have noticed is that the entire concept of personal responsibility and taking control of your life, a lot of that I think has been co-opted, frankly, by often rather dishonest actors who want to pretend as though we're all operating in a vacuum, we're all on equal footing, these are all choices and movements that are really under our control, when I think, frankly, in many cases they're not. But I also think going to the other end and only focusing on sort of the macro issues and only focusing on what's going on around us at a larger scale, and in some way abdicating our responsibility to be really sort of in control as much as we can over our individual lives, that is something that I see a lot, and I wonder, how can we more integrate that concept of personal responsibility without rejecting all of the realities that many of us live in?
Well, when it comes to personal finance, I think it just comes down to education. And in the same way that critical thinking is basically not taught, period, unless you seek out critical thinking in college, for example, critical thinking and personal finance really should be taught probably starting at age 12. I mean, it's middle school really where it should start to be taught. You're right that the political right has completely co-opted the idea of personal responsibility, even though in practice they're often not living it. I think we're seeing that in a lot of different ways, which we could talk about, but we don't need to. But the idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps is great, but what if you don't have bootstraps and can't afford to get them?
Right.
Then what do you do? And I think that that's sort of the way in which someone like me, whose political views are what's called social democracy, which is a system that is capitalist, there is private ownership of business, people can get wealthy in that system, but we are saying we are going to prioritize using taxation to make sure that no one gets below a certain level. Often this includes healthcare, often this includes education, it can include paid family medical leave for mothers and fathers. It is personal responsibility, but it's a different flavor of it.
So often, a lot of the personal finance advice almost has to come, and I include this channel in it, by the way, we are part of this issue, it's inescapable. It almost comes with an unspoken asterisk of like, if you are above a certain level of income. So what are some of the ways that you have found in the way that you talk, for example, about economic issues to really kind of bridge that gap and make it clear that like, there are some things under our control, but a substantial amount that are not?
Sure. So the first thing is just understanding that in the United States, over long periods of time, income mobility is quite low. So if you want to focus overly on a latte or avocado toast or whatever other
which he ate this morning.
Which I had this morning, and it was very good, I must say. If you want to focus too much on those things, what you have to do is zoom out a little bit and realize most people who are born poor stay poor. Most people who are born middle class stay middle class. Most people who are born rich stay rich. Yes, there are celebrities and athletes and startup people who go from anywhere to super rich, but these are small numbers of people. They are not representative of most of what's going on. So then when you realize that income mobility is really low, you have to ask yourself, are the people who are born poor staying poor because they're not smart enough to be more than poor? Are the people who are born rich staying rich because they also happen to be smart enough to remain rich? And of course the answer is no. Once you realize that income mobility is so limited because of the overarching infrastructures that exist, then you can start to understand why the financial advice that's good for someone who is even lower middle class and up is not going to be applicable to people who are, in a literal sense, paycheck to paycheck, but not only paycheck to paycheck, meal to meal. as the case may be, you have to be able to distinguish that. And that's where, how do you not talk about politics, right?
Well, I agree. But it's interesting because, I mean, at least from my perspective, and this is obviously anecdotal, this is not, I have no data on this, but I bet if someone were to do it, the data would bear it out, that the vast majority of financial media out there, especially the older stuff, is very, very right-wing, if not explicitly so in their approach to how we all move through the world. It's like often just like quasi-libertarian. It's very sort of like we're all, I mean, it's almost like doomsday prepper in some capacities.
Well, it's certainly anti-regulation in that sense. It's you want the government to have a role and as little involvement as possible in what businesses do, because that's what's going to be best for the businesses. And what's unfortunate about that is that a lot of the same people that say they are against socialism, when they push for that type of infrastructure, you are essentially socializing the negative externalities of what businesses do. So you say, I want the government, imagine an energy company that's doing fracking or drilling of different kinds. They want the government out as much as possible from any kind of regulation so that the profits are all capitalist. And then when there's a big spill or something that needs to be cleaned up, well, they're totally fine with socializing the cost to clean that up.
So one of the reasons why I think that most of personal finance media is just like, it has to have this political framing is because people don't want to hear, they're not going to pay money for a book that says you're probably not going to escape your current situation within a range, right? Like you're probably going to fall within the same standard deviation.
Well, I would go even further. Who has the most power to dictate what becomes policy in the US? Big corporations and very rich people. They benefit from convincing other people that they too may one day be rich. And a few of them will be, sure. But most of them are not going to be. And how are you going to convince people to push for a tax policy that benefits you and not them, unless you, at least to some degree, convince them that some portion of them is going to benefit at some point in the future, even though most are not? It's necessary to convince people to push for some of these policies, or at least look the other way when you push for them.
Well, and I would also say that there's a real value in creating a sense of resentment amongst people of lower income or towards people of lower income, because you make it a character question.
And you're probably not going to think deeply about what your role has to be or
right.
should be in changing that status quo.
Right.
I, as someone who was born in Argentina and my family, via a visa lottery, ended up coming to the United States, the David Pakman Show wouldn't exist if I still lived in Argentina, because by chance my family didn't get the visas that we got. I would be the same person. I would have conceivably the same cognitive and intellectual capacity. I might even end up with some of the same interests. But the happenstance of that visa is what made it so that now I have a national talk show and an ad agency, rather than whatever it is I would have in Argentina. That's purely timing, odds, or luck. I mean, it's literally odds that some people get the visas and some people don't.
A few things I think illustrate this better than when you look at the second generation or third or fourth generation of people who come from great wealth and power, who are visibly incompetent, who have clearly messed up more than they've succeeded, but who continue to fail upwards, because once you reach a certain level of money and influence and power, there's basically no stopping you.
Sure, and I think that's why a lot of my views, which again I sort of consider under the umbrella of what's called social democracy, the wealth of people that did things to become wealthy long before you were alive serves as almost like an insurance policy for you if you were born into that situation. What about also creating some kind of insurance policy for people who aren't born into that situation to make sure that their standard of living doesn't drop below a certain level? I think we should.
Well, absolutely. And I think we need to be much more honest with ourselves about what it means for most people who are successful to have worked hard. The idea that people who are at a certain level have worked to get there, which first of all implies that all the other people just didn't work as hard, which is almost categorically untrue. But even if it were true, when you look at the pay disparity between executives and the person manning the counter, it is physically impossible that they have worked, 17,000 times harder than the other person. But for some reason, that framing of working as primarily what gets people to a certain economic status seems to me to not go away. Do you know why that is?
Well, I think that there's a total lack of perspective as to what goes into getting a person or a business to where it is today. And it's very easy to say, listen, you've got a show and employees and it's now, successful to a certain degree. That's because of your hard work, and you deserve all of the fruits that has produced. Well, do I really deserve all of it because I have employees who come to work using public transit and have been educated by the public education system? I have a intellectual property protection infrastructure which the government and the legal system is involved in. Like I didn't create all that stuff.
No.
I benefit from all of that stuff. So how can I really say that it was all me if we didn't have that? If we didn't have institutions that to some degree can be trusted, even though of course there is corruption and malfeasance. If we didn't have those things, a lot of these businesses that were supposedly created by hard workers would not exist, quite simply.
For a certain trench of the American economic population,
Cohort.
A certain cohort, there is a fair level of mobility and autonomy. Like I think it is realistic, and I'm sure the data bears this out, to go from like if you were born into a family that earns, I don't know, like $60,000 a year to potentially earn, quite a bit more than that as an adult.
Yeah,
and a lot of that will come within reason.
Statistically, it's not. I mean, when you talk about inflation adjustment, and
right.
also there's more travel, people moving within the United States to areas that have a higher cost of living, but also tend to have higher salaries. Yeah, that level of mobility is much more significant than what is happening at the very bottom, for sure.
For those who fall beneath that ability, at least for now, what else do you think is really tangibly something that we can offer them?
The tough thing about this is I could give a list of 10 things, and 9 of them, a lot of people would say, you are totally out of touch because that wouldn't work for people in X situation. So I feel like there's no one prescription for everybody, but I feel like the principles tend to basically be the same ones. I mean, it's spend less than you earn if possible. Some people can't do it.
It's true.
If you have children, if you live in a high cost of living area, there's all sorts of situations where it can't be done. You need an emergency fund. You need a budget. You need to understand what's coming in and what's going out. You want to only use credit, particularly higher interest credit, when absolutely and completely necessary. You need to understand, which now is made a little clearer from credit card bills that people get, if you make the minimum payment, how long is it going to take you to pay it off, and what is the total amount of interest that you're going to pay, which was very opaque before newer regulations were passed about how that has to be disclosed. It's not about the latte millionaire versus the latte poor person. That's an exaggeration, but understand the impact of doing grocery shopping one way versus another way, and of eating out, right? I mean, it's like it needs to be tailored to the individual financial situation. For most people, there are changes that would apply to them, but it's really tough because it can appear almost patronizing sometimes to say things that appear so obvious for people who really are not in financial situations where these are the types of decisions they need to be making.
That is very true, and I do feel personally that once you get to a point in life where these decisions are not so fraught and you have the mental and often just pure time bandwidth to expand your view of these things a little bit, I personally think that it's an ethical obligation to involve yourself to some extent in the political world, because you can't escape it. And even if for you it doesn't make a huge difference who's in office because you're kind of going to be fine either way, that is very much not the case for many real individuals. But I'm sure that a lot of people respond to things like this and say, well, what am I supposed to do? I'm not going to sit and scream on Twitter about it all day like a lot of people do. I vote. What else is there that's available to people, particularly when it comes to a lot of these very, very tangible economic issues?
There's a lot of people. The presidential election gets so much attention that it can often seem like that is really like the primary way to participate in the political system. But there are so many other ways, and often at the local level, and for financial stuff, it's often at the state level that a huge difference can be made, because a lot of what is going on, I mean, yes, federal tax rates are a big thing. If you're below a certain level, the federal tax rate is not going to play a big role in your year-to-year sort of budget. There's a lot of stuff happening at the state level in terms of programs that are available to low-income people, and most of this stuff is politics. There's often a divide between the American left and the American right on these issues. So getting involved, it can't just be every 4 years in the presidential election, and a lot of people aren't even doing that. But city councils, state governments, governors, although they are very political, they are also much more administrative than something like a president or a senator is. So there's many opportunities at the local and state level to get involved. Sometimes people will say, I'm not political and I'm not into politics. And that's fine, but either way, it's affecting your life. Not voting or not being involved is not a neutral act. And that's what I try to tell people who call into my show and they say, my vote's not going to make a difference, which, by the way, we could talk about that talking point, which makes no sense. My vote's not going to make a difference. And I'm not really that into politics. I'm into A, B, C. And almost invariably A, B, and C are heavily influenced by politics. So you can be involved or not be involved. Either way, it's a decision.
What are some of the biggest ways in which you stay optimistic and positive and perhaps most of all productive?
I try to just look at the things that are going okay or at least slightly better. So if you look at the number of people in abject poverty, even if we understand that in a world of inflation and changing political realities, and there's all these different caveats, we have made some progress in reducing that. We are hopefully starting to get consensus on the urgency of the climate crisis to where maybe in the next 10 years it will be taken seriously enough that we could get to some kind of deceleration of the problem. I mean, I know that this is like a low bar, but you've kind of got to start somewhere. Also, I do think that there are just ideas that are good ideas that are more popular than ever. So the idea that if you can't afford healthcare, the government should provide some basic level for you. That idea is more popular than ever in the United States. If you're a social progressive, gay marriage approval, and the idea that abortion should be legal, safe, and accessible in most cases, those ideas have more support than ever before in American society for as long as there has been polling on these issues. So those are all good things. The elected officials often lag behind a little bit. Right now, the American electorate is to the left of the average elected official. So hopefully with time and fixing some of the gerrymandering and campaign finance and all of that other stuff that is preventing this from improving, hopefully over time that will pull our elected officials more in the direction we want them to be.
So those are my questions for David, but now we have the much more interesting and thoughtful questions, which are coming from you guys. How do you actively contribute to future capital accounts, i.e. 401k, Roth IRA, etc., when the Earth is inevitably going to implode from climate change / famine / disease / war before you can access these funds?
So my thought there is, if it's going to be that bad, then what does it matter where my money is?
Exactly.
It won't be anything. So at least I suspend momentarily the possibility that may be the reality and just make the decisions that I think are best, assuming that humans continue to be able to live on Earth. If it doesn't work out that way, it won't really have mattered where the money was, whether it was in a high-yield online savings account or in a 401k or whatever. And yeah, that's just a reality.
Don't live like you're going to die tomorrow. Like, that's a horrible way to live. You're probably going to be alive tomorrow. And what are you going to want when that happens? And retirement savings is very much sort of along those lines. Honestly, as dark as this is, the most realistic outcome is that, like, by the time you're taking that money out, like, most of Miami Beach will be underwater, but they will have long since found a way to monetize that. And part of your 401k will be in the companies whose job it is to pump out luxury condos. How are young professionals supposed to balance their need to make as much as possible to pay off their nearly mandatory debt with their desire to not feed certain industries or companies whose practices and values are morally objectionable?
Everybody has to figure out where they are drawing the line. I mean, there may be, so some people would be in the mindset of, I will never take a dollar from a company in X industry, no matter how desperately I need that dollar. That might be the right decision for one person. Someone else might say, I'm going to take this job for the next 5 years. If I don't take it, someone else will. Either way, this company's going to do the bad stuff that they're going to do. It will allow me to get out of debt more quickly and then really get into the field where I'm going to improve society and better the world around me. That's a very personal decision everybody needs to make for themselves.
I like to take the money from the capitalists and use it to fund a very co-op-y company. So, How aggressively do we need to be paying off student loans given that A, we want to live, and B, they will hopefully be forgiven maybe?
So the forgiveness is a newer piece, but this kind of gets to the same question that I often talk about in terms of like paying more off of your mortgage than what is actually required on a month-to-month basis. This is different for everybody because you have to, number one, calculate the difference between the interest rate on the student loan or the mortgage versus what the return might be on what else you might do with that money. If you consider the stock market over long periods returns 8%, then if your mortgage is 3.5%, you might choose not to pay the mortgage off early. There's also something to be said for just like the safety and security of having a cash cushion. So even if you are choosing to continue paying 3, 4, 5% interest on something in order to have a cash cushion, that has a significant psychological impact, including of knowing that if you lose your job, you could go however long it is that you could go with that cushion without needing to have replaced that job. And that's a really powerful thing for a lot of people. So I think that, again, it's your mileage may vary and every situation is different.
We actually advise that people get a couple months of emergency fund before they start paying anything above the minimum. Like, you have to pay the minimum until you have that. Because what happens if, like you said, you lose a job?
No emergency fund is an emergency.
Might have to steal that. Thank you so much, David, for being a part of this. I'm very still all giddy about it. But please go check out the David Pakman Show on YouTube and elsewhere. I'll link you guys in the description. I can't recommend it enough.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. As always, guys, thank you for watching. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button and to come back every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday for new and awesome videos. Bye.